So Robert Alton Harris was a young man who was very heavily involved in crime in the 1970s in California. And on one occasion, he wanted to commit an armed robbery, and he managed to steal some guns with his brother. And they then found two young boys sitting in a car park eating a hamburger. And they hijacked their car at gunpoint and ended up executing these two young boys in very cold blood. And Robert Alton Harris, by all accounts, was a pretty horrible, evil man. His brother describes him shooting these boys dead and then grabbing the hamburgers and finishing them off and then laughing and joking thereafter. And when he was arrested and imprisoned, he was subsequently sentenced to death, and he was seen as so awful a human being by his fellow prisoners in San Quentin prison, which was, a pretty awful place, that they organized a party to celebrate his death. And so when you hear this story, you think, God, this man was pure evil. But actually, there is another side to him, which is that he was born one of several siblings to a mother who was alcoholic. His father was alcoholic as well. He probably experienced fetal alcohol syndrome as a result. He was born prematurely because his father beat up his mother. He accused her of infidelity, and as a result, she went into labor early. And very early on in life, his mother refused to touch him, and in fact, on one occasion, beat him up when he tried to touch her. He ended up being put into the equivalent of a borstal, where he was raped repeatedly and then went off the rails. So obviously, a terrible early life, probably very poor genetic background, certainly a poor environment in his mother's womb, and a terrible upbringing. And so the question really about Robert Alton Harris is how much of his life was predestined by his circumstances that were completely outside of his control, and how much of it can be related to the fact that he was just evil, to use again a slightly more religious or moral term. And I think the answer to that is not clear.
Okay, welcome to the show. I'm joined here by Professor Guy Leschziner. So he just published a fascinating book on the 7 deadly sins. So to get started, Guy, can you maybe just tell us about the central thesis of your new book?
Yeah, I spend my professional life seeing patients with neurological disorders. And it's very clear that actually in some of the patients that I see, their neurological dysfunction or neurological disorder is what influences their behavior. So in essence, essentially the structure or the function of their brain robs them of their free will, if you will, at least with regard to certain behaviors. And I became rather fascinated by this because, of course, patients' diseases, disorders are nature's experiments. They tell us a little bit about how the brain works. And I think that when you dig into this, what we begin to see is that for all of us, there are factors beyond our control, be they genetic, so they're from the point of conception, be they related to our environment, either within the womb or even beyond the womb, or actually as a result of our upbringing or diseases or disorders that influence our behavior and therefore rob all of us to some extent of free will. And so the question then is, well, if there are these factors that are beyond our control that influence who we are and what we are, then what does that tell us about free will? What does it tell us about whether, to some extent, for all of us, there is an aspect of this, an aspect of our behavior that is biological, and we should be viewing it as such, that we should be moving away from the viewpoint that an individual's actions are good or evil and understanding them more in a biological perspective.
So if we can say then that sin is primarily biological, what do you feel are the major societal implications, both good and bad, of this perspective?
Well, I think that, when I first say this, a lot of people say, so are you saying that, you know, the criminal justice system is pointless? Are you saying that a moral framework is pointless? And that's not at all what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that if you understand the biological factors that we as individuals have no influence over, but perhaps society can influence, then that at least gives us a framework, a methodology to try and improve those factors that society can modify or modulate, and actually have long lasting repercussions for society as a whole.
Hmm. I think it can potentially lead to a much more compassionate society as well. And we'd be much less quick to judge people. And on the individual level, I want to ask about from this point of view as well. When I was preparing for this, an example that came to mind for me. So when I was primary 7 at school in the UK, we were in the cafeteria and we had a new headmaster that week, right? And I was 11 years old. I was having my lunch and I was I'm diabetic, so I was hypoglycemic as I'm eating my lunch, right? And the headmaster came over and I wasn't in the right state of mind, obviously. And he asked me a question and I said something cheeky back because I was it's sometimes being that low is a little bit like being drunk. You're just not thinking straight, okay? So I said something cheeky back and he just totally lost the head in front of the whole cafeteria and was like roaring and shouting. And, it totally destroyed me at the time. Took me, and when I was thinking about your book, I was like, you know, looking at like if I was just looking at from the outside point of view without this understanding that these sort of sins are biological or there's a biological root, it it gives us a much more black and white view of human nature. So I do think there's really important implications, both for the individual and society here, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think your example is absolutely at the essence of what I'm talking about. So, you know, diabetes, blood sugar fluctuations, I think are very clearly a manifestation of a brain disorder. So it's a transient brain disorder because essentially, your brain can only use glucose as a fuel. And if you don't have enough glucose in your system, then you get transient brain dysfunction, which results in changes to your behavior, in changes to your cognition. One of some of the examples that I give in the book of conditions that can influence our sins, and I use the term sins in inverted commas, are conditions that, yes, for some individuals are, structural problems. They are tumors to the brain or traumatic brain injury. But in many other people, transient changes to the brain function can result in marked changes to behavior. Conditions like epilepsy, where people are entirely normal in between their seizures, but in the context of their seizures or in the aftermath, part of their brain is not working properly. And so they exhibit marked changes in behavior. That medications, for example, diabetes, even sleepwalking. So people, the subject of one of my other books is about what people do during their sleep. And, sleepwalking can be considered a transient abnormality of brain function as well. And, diabetes is very much one of these conditions.
Mhm. Now, have you thought about, or was any part of you worried that by suggesting that sin is primarily biological, if we take this, can this be taken too far? Can this absolve individuals from all responsibility? Like, is there a limit to how far we can go with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question is not only a neurobiological question, it's also a philosophical question as well. And as you having read the book, you're probably quite aware of the fact that I don't come down firmly in one position or another. What I say is that there are some individuals who I meet in my clinics in whom I think it can be argued that they don't have any free will. They don't have a moral responsibility for their behavior. For many of us, there are some contributions that are outside of our control. And if we're very lucky and our brains are structurally and chemically intact, and we have a particular genetic burden that is protective, and we have had a very healthy upbringing, I think one can argue that there is more moral responsibility. But I think the place to start is really to try and understand these kinds of behaviors not as sins. There's a reason why pretty much every world religion is obsessed with sin, because all of these behaviors are ubiquitous. They're at the core of what makes us human. And these kinds of behaviors, lust, wrath, and so on, are all behaviors that have an evolutionary imperative. And so the distinction is really, if our brains are equipped to be able to generate these kinds of behaviors or emotions in an appropriate setting and at an appropriate intensity. It's when these kinds of behaviors are exhibited inappropriately or overly intensely, and they create problems for ourselves as individuals or the society in which we inhabit, that they then become problematic and then can be labeled as sins.
One of the things you said there about, people having different degrees of free will almost. And we've done a summit on addiction before. And one of the things I kind of took away from that is that every human being is operating with a different, almost like choice window. Like people in the thralls of addiction, that window is very, very narrow. People that are very free and in a good situation in life, that choice window is much broader, and I think that's really important to keep in mind as we're interacting with people throughout the day. um so in terms of, you mentioned there about these sins actually in the right context, in the evolutionary environment that we evolved in for hundreds of thousands of years. They served a purpose, um, and they were adaptive back then. So I think one of the key ideas that I took from the book was that evolutionary mismatch seems to be what has turned these things from adaptive to maladaptive. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, I would go a little bit further than that. I think that all of these behaviors serve a useful purpose even in today's world. Um, Obviously, our environment has changed significantly over the last few hundred years compared to the vast majority of human evolution. And so, particularly when it comes to the modern world, some of those behaviors, in particular things like gluttony, to use the sort of sinful terminology, have turned from being, as you say, an adaptive mechanism. Because, of course, from an evolutionary perspective, when we were hunter gatherers, to consume calories whenever they were available was very important to our survival. They were very important to the survival of ourselves and of our offspring. Whereas now, of course, we live in an entirely different world when it comes to calories. And so that underlying mechanism that causes us to seek out food when we have it available and to seek out food that is particularly calorie rich um, has now become a maladaptive response. But even when it comes to things like wrath or pride, anger is a emotional reinforcer of behavior that is as a result of thwarted goals or defense. And we know that even now anger can have some beneficial consequences. We talk about righteous anger. We talk about the fact that actually, people get angry when they see injustice. If you take individuals in a psychology laboratory and you give them a task that is actually that doesn't have any solution, and you see whether or not they get angry or whether they get despondent. If you then give them another puzzle to do, one that is difficult but has a solution, the ones who get angry will persist longer and will often get to the right solution. So anger drives us in achieving our goals. Similarly, pride. If you induce pride in student in a psychology lab, in a psychology experiment, then pride will often result in a better outcome in the task that they're undertaking. And obviously the same with lust. If we didn't have a sexual drive, if we didn't have an imperative to have sex, then that would be the death knell of our species, because that is fundamental to our passing on our genes. Now, of course, there are reasons that have been hypothesized as to why we don't just, to use a non-technical term, go at it with abandon, because that potentially has negative consequences from an evolutionary perspective, in humans at least. But all of these basic drives are the things that stand between survival and extinction.
Hmm. Now, after you'd finished writing this book, Guy, were you left with any burning questions or unanswered questions that have sort of thought, "Oh, that could be my next book"? You've brought up free will there. Is that an area that you're wanting to go deeper into, or where are you at right now?
So, I mean, the question of free will is I think is a question that is not going to be answered in my lifetime, and I think is an argument that will rage on and on. As you know, there's been a bit of a turning back, because in the 1980s, experiments that were done by somebody called Libet really demonstrated what were thought to be definitive neurophysiological correlates of decision making. And Libet suggested that actually we made decisions several milliseconds, sometimes even several seconds, before we were consciously aware of them. And that experiment, which was termed Libet's clock, was really used as a weapon by those individuals who very much felt that free will was illusory. But actually, in recent years, that has been rowed back on a little, because I think that we have a slightly different perspective on what his experiments mean. But certainly, even now, there are plenty of neuroscientists, plenty of philosophers, and indeed in some religions, whereby free will is seen as something illusory, and that actually our brains are making decisions far before they enter into our conscious mind, which is obviously on a personal level deeply disturbing, because we think that we have the ability to choose to go left or to go right. I have the ability to choose to say hello to you or to swear in your face. And it feels as though that's under conscious control. So for somebody to say to me, well, actually, that decision is made for you by your brain without any conscious awareness, is somewhat running contrary to my whole experience of myself and my life. So it's a really fascinating area. And I very much look forward to seeing what the next generation of neuroscientists and philosophers add to that debate. But I don't think that debate is going to be complete.
Okay, okay. Well, while we're on the subject of free will, you tell the story of Robert Alton Harris, and I think this is really illustrative. Could you just give us just the broad bullet points of that story
Yeah.
and why this is relevant here?
So Robert Alton Harris was a young man who was very heavily involved in crime in the 1970s in California. And on one occasion, he wanted to commit an armed robbery, and he managed to steal some guns with his brother. And they then found two young boys sitting in a car park eating a hamburger. And they hijacked their car at gunpoint and ended up executing these two young boys in very cold blood. And Robert Alton Harris, by all accounts, was a pretty horrible, evil man. His brother describes him shooting these boys dead and then grabbing the hamburgers and finishing them off, and then laughing and joking thereafter. And when he was arrested and imprisoned, he was subsequently sentenced to death, and he was seen as so awful a human being by his fellow prisoners in San Quentin prison, which was, a pretty awful place, that they organized a party to celebrate his death. And so when you hear this story, you think, God, this man was pure evil. But actually, there is another side to him, which is that he was born one of several siblings to a mother who was alcoholic. His father was alcoholic as well. He probably experienced fetal alcohol syndrome as a result. He was born prematurely because his father beat up his mother. He accused her of infidelity, and as a result, she went into labour early. And very early on in life, his mother refused to touch him, and in fact, on one occasion, beat him up when he tried to touch her. He ended up being put into the equivalent of a borstal where he was raped repeatedly and then went off the rails. So obviously, a terrible early life, probably very poor genetic background, certainly a poor environment in his mother's womb, and a terrible upbringing. And so the question really about Robert Alton Harris is how much of his life was predestined by his circumstances that were completely outside of his control, and how much of it can be related to the fact that he was just evil, to use again a slightly more religious or moral term. And I think the answer to that is not clear.
And yeah, that really makes you think, because that guy is born with just the worst luck ever, and he's got. We're talking about choice window earlier. Like he just was, just the worst, dealt the worst hand possible. I'm curious to ask, after the amount of thought you've put into this, where do you personally stand on the issue of free will? Do you feel you have free will?
I would like to think I have free will. Now, whether I do or not is another matter. And, I'm also very conscious of the fact that me simply saying this, is it my free will to believe what I want? Or is it my genetics, my upbringing, my education that is telling me this? Look, it's a very difficult thing for any human being to imagine that they don't have free will, as I already said. My own view, I think, is that there is a spectrum. There is a spectrum of free will. And I think you would describe it as a choice window. I think essentially what we're talking about is the same thing. And, our ability to make a choice is defined by the structure and the function of our brains, depending on what has gone before, our inheritance, our childhood, our upbringing, that choice window or the degree of free will that we have in any particular circumstances is different.
Yeah, for me, what this brings to mind is like the aim of the game then becomes like, is there anything that I can do if I do have any degree of free will to widen that spectrum or widen that choice window?
Yeah.
Because
So I think that's a really good question. So what I'm not saying, and what some people have kind of taken away from the reading the summary of the book rather than the book itself, is that there is nothing that we can do to alter our behavior. And that's absolutely not true. One of the things that I do spend quite a lot of time writing about is the fact that the brain is a plastic organ. It can be molded. It changes throughout our lives. It changes according to what we experience, how we live our lives. And it also, of course, importantly, and this is particularly relevant when it comes to things like crime and punishment and a moral framework, the kinds of, the Ten Commandments or the Seven Deadly Sins as taught by the Catholic Church. Because actually the brain responds to reward and punishment. And actually behavior changes in response to reward and punishment. And so it is, important to explicitly state that actually, our brain structure and function is not necessarily fixed at all. For some people, depending on, what they bring, their brain function and structure is likely to be fixed, and nothing that we do, nothing that they do, nothing that a doctor does or the criminal justice system does is going to fundamentally change their behavior. But for most of us, we have the ability to change our brains. And that's when things like clinical psychology, psychiatry, medicine, neurology can all have a bearing.
Hmm. And do you make any distinction between mind and brain, or is that the same thing for you?
Well, for me, I'm a neuroscientist, and I think most neuroscientists would view the old beliefs of mind body dualism as being incorrect. I think there are many areas of neuroscience that we simply do not understand at the moment, but I think that ultimately we will find that everything emanates from the brain. And I think that, one of the key aspects that I wanted to put across was, well, if a traumatic brain injury, if Huntington's disease, if Parkinson's disease, if drugs can fundamentally alter your personality, can alter your behavior, then it tells you that that behavior emanates from the brain itself, not from a separate entity of the mind.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, well, you being a psychiatrist, you will have seen.
I'm a neurologist rather than a psychiatrist, but we do both. Yeah,
My apologies, my apologies. But one of the things you mentioned in the book is that your view on human nature is guided by the clinical work that you've done.
yeah.
And if you have experience, if anybody has experience with dealing with people that have severe mental health conditions, you see that there is a point where things happen where the person is not in control, and that is a very humbling thing to witness, especially
Mhm.
in loved ones. So yeah, I don't know. And just one other question on this subject of mind and brain. I don't know why this came to mind to ask you, but I just thought I would. Have you thought much about the hard problem of consciousness in this area?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it a little bit at the moment, actually. Yeah.
Any thoughts you want to share, or?
Well, this is not an area that I'm a particular expert in, and there are many more qualified people to comment upon it, like people like Anna Seth, who has written that very fascinating book, Being You. I think that what can I say? It is a hard problem. I don't think I don't think we know what the neurobiological origins of consciousness are. I think there are lots of theories. I think that we can find neural correlates of consciousness, but as you know, correlation doesn't always mean that that's the underlying cause. I think again, as with free will, there is going to be an ongoing debate for many, many years as to where consciousness originates. And even now, there remain some very wildly different theories as to what consciousness actually constitutes.
Yeah, yeah, it's probably a conversation for a different day. Maybe that could be. Yeah,
I think conversation for somebody who spends their life day in, day out wrestling with the hard problem of consciousness.
yeah, yeah. No, Anil Seth, you mentioned there. He's done a couple of talks or an interview with us. Brilliant mind. But so in the book, you you don't spend a lot on it, but I find this a really interesting thing to think about. Is this idea of self-domestication, the self-domestication hypothesis? Can you maybe just share a bit about that and its relevance here?
So sorry, I'm just going to interrupt Niall. So when you say self domestication, you mean a sort of a socialization of us that we are no longer wild savages? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, we've basically domesticated ourselves in the same way
Yeah,
that we've domesticated certain animals.
yeah. Well, I think that when it comes to violence, one of the fascinating findings is that the human violence profile is very different to the violence profile of our nearest relatives, so bonobos and chimps. When you look at violence, when you look at aggression, we think of it in terms of reactive aggression and proactive aggression. And actually, compared to our nearest animal relatives, the profile of levels of reactive and proactive aggression is rather different. So, which raises the question as to why that might have arisen. What is it in our evolution that has modulated our our violence profiles. And one of the really fascinating theories as to why that might be the case is that actually, because of our cognitive abilities, because of our language abilities, we have been in a position, unlike chimps and bonobos, to be able to conspire against alpha males. So, particularly alpha males who exhibit too much aggression, we have been able to take out alpha males who have been overly dominant and overly aggressive. And so, over time, the fact is that our ability to do that, our ability to generate planned proactive aggression, has actually provided an evolutionary pressure that has then modulated our aggression profile. So that is kind of a little bit similar to your own view about self-domestication. I think that there are also, when it comes to, for example, lust, theories which have been termed sexual strategies theory that explain why we go down the route of long-term relationships, unlike the vast majority of animals, because from an evolutionary perspective, that has been beneficial to our long-term survival. So, I guess that both of those examples are something akin to what you would term self-domestication, in that essentially evolutionary pressures have shifted us towards living more happily in a society that benefits all of us. And that's what domestication is.
Yeah, that idea of proactive aggression actually potentially serving as a or having an advantage in an evolutionary past is fascinating because have you heard of Paul? I think it's Paul Bingham. I'm probably getting the name wrong, but I learned about him through David Sloan Wilson, who's an evolutionary biologist, and his theory is that there was a major leap in our evolutionary history whenever we developed the ability to throw stones, because whenever this happened, we could have proactive aggression against alphas that were potentially not doing things too much greed, doing things just out of their own interest and not the interest of the group. And then whenever you had the beta males or whatever, they could then take out this guy with the stones, and then groups became then more altruistic and more cooperative because they had this mechanism. So that
Yeah.
would pair well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is significant overlap between that view. I mean, I think another interesting example is what it is that has led us to perhaps carry genes that allow us to grow fatter. Um, and actually, one of the theories surrounding that is that if you look at the evolution of species that were our ancient ancestors, there seems to have been a dramatic increase in size of our genus associated with our ability to fight off predators, to start using fire and weapons to fight off predators. Because actually, when we had no defense against these predators, then the onus was on us to run away as quickly as possible. And obviously, having a lower body weight facilitated that. It was when we developed the ability to fight off larger predators that the ancestors of humans grew significantly. And in fact, a significant change in our size correlates quite well with the extinction of certain predators at around the same time.
Ooh, interesting. You mentioned there a little bit about obesity as well, and this is seen as a very kind of, again, black and white issue in society. If you want to lose weight, just like, you know, move more and eat less, and these you hear these kind of things, but it's never that simple. And in the book, you talk about, I think it was a Dutch winter study. Could you
Hmm.
maybe tell us some of the key findings from this study?
Yeah, so in the early 1940s, towards the tail end of the war, the Dutch government in exile, in support of the Allies who were trying to force their way across Western Europe, called a general strike in Holland. And the Nazis, in essentially in punishment for that general strike, they halted all food transportation around the country. Now, after a couple of months, that that halting of food movement stopped. But unfortunately, there was a very, very deep, cold winter, and all the canals that were being used to move food from the agricultural east of the Netherlands to the main population centres in the west froze over. And as a result, there was a significant famine in the Netherlands, in particular in Amsterdam. And initially, pregnant women and children were protected from its worst effects. But as the famine continued, even pregnant women were very, very calorie restricted. And so, for women who were pregnant at that time, the offspring that were born after that winter, after that famine, were followed up for many, many years. And what was demonstrated was that those individuals who were starved at a very early age in their gestation, so in the first trimester, and then subsequently had access to normal calories in the latter half of the pregnancy or their mother's pregnancy, actually were born a normal size, but in later life put on weight much more easily, and indeed had many more consequences to that weight gain, including things like cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome. Whereas those who were starved in the latter half of the pregnancy were born at a low body weight, but did not grow up to be obese and have all of these complications. And it was out of that study that certainly the first evidence that our environment in the very earliest stages of our development can influence the metabolism of our organs, and indeed even possibly those circuits within our brains that mediate our appetite.
That's incredible. Um, and just on that note, you also talking about PWS, Prader-Willi syndrome, and
Prader-Willi syndrome, yeah.
can you tell us about this here as well?
Yeah, so Prader-Willi syndrome is a genetic condition that results in a variety of different changes to health. But one of the biggest issues for people with PWS is that they have abnormalities in an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is really at the core of the brain, and it's where many of our very basic behaviors, our basic instincts are encoded. So things like thirst, um, sexual drive, sleep, all of those things are processed. And one of the other roles of the hypothalamus is really to influence our appetite. We know that actually the body fat, rather than being a passive store of calories, actually is an active organ, and it secretes certain hormones, including a hormone called leptin. And leptin is a measure of your body's fat or calorie stores. And when it is detected by the hypothalamus, and that's what shuts off our appetite. It makes us feel less hungry. It makes us feel sated. And in Prader-Willi syndrome, because of abnormalities of the hypothalamus in terms of how it functions, these individuals seem to be almost entirely insensitive to any chemical signals from the body that they've got enough calories on board, that they don't need to eat anymore. And so individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, and I illustrate that with a particular example of a woman called Alex, who never feels sated. She always feels hungry. She's never able to feel full. And she will eat whatever is presented to her, will always feel hungry, will continuously search out for calories, to such an extent that actually in her home, which she was sharing with other people with Prader-Willi syndrome, the carers had to put locks on the kitchen doors, they had to put locks on the food bins, and they had to search any packages that were being delivered to the house to look for any food that they might be trying to smuggle in. And these individuals, alongside this irresistible urge to eat, will have really terrible consequences. Terrible obesity. They will occasionally die because they have perforated their stomach from eating too much, or will eat so much that they regurgitate their food and can die of pneumonia as a result. Now, that's a really good example of how a genetic change can dramatically influence our appetite, or gluttony in another context. And it's not just Prader-Willi syndrome. There are lots of other genetic disorders that can also influence our body weight. There are particular genetic mutations that arise in certain families whereby children will be 10 or 20 kilos by 1 year of age and will be 50 kilos by 5 years of age. Again, for the same reason that their hypothalamus is insensitive to those chemical signals. Now, you may think, well, these are all rare individuals, and indeed they are. But what we know is that to some extent, our body weight is, for all of us, is determined by a whole range of genes and genetic variants, as well as many other things, of course.
Yeah. Apologies, because I know nothing about this area. But with regards to leptin and that sort of being a hormone that regulates how hungry we feel, have there again, I know nothing about the area, so I'm just asking the stupid question. Have there been studies done where like people take exogenous leptin as a way to regulate appetite? Like, has this been done? Has this been
Yeah.
tried?
Well, I think the GLP-1 agonists, things like Mounjaro and Wegovy and Ozempic, do something very similar. And certainly, getting leptin into the brain, exogenous leptin into the brain, is actually not without its challenges. But certainly, yes, if you infuse leptin into somebody's bloodstream, they will tend to stop eating. The difficulty is that there is some evidence that actually in people who are very obese, actually the leptin may not be transported into the brain quite so easily. So even if you give them something to suppress their leptin, uh, if you give them leptin, then they might not feel sated to the same extent that somebody is not obese. And that gives rise to the view that actually once you reach a certain level of obesity, then you are on a vicious spiral to further obesity.
God, it's the same.
But of course, it's really important to stress, Niall, that actually leptin is only one of the factors that influences our appetite. There's a whole host of other things that influence our appetite as well, including our emotional state and those circuits within the brain that mediate reward. We all know the reward of a slice of chocolate cake or or something sweet. And there is separate circuitry that mediates that reward, and that reward also has other effects. So we know that, for example, if you take rats and you give them a very high calorie diet, a very high sugar or high fat diet, and then you give them a substance called naloxone, which is the antidote to drugs like morphine or endogenous intrinsic opioids, then essentially what happens is they get a withdrawal response that you don't see in rats that are not given a high calorie diet. So suggesting that actually, well, when you eat these substances, it causes the release of substances within the brain like morphine or fentanyl or things like that. Um, and you can begin to understand then why there is this phenomenon of comfort eating, for example, because actually, if you're feeling a bit down, if you're feeling a bit anxious, and you release some opiates within the brain, then that's going to make you feel calmer. It's going to make you feel happier. So there's a whole host of these factors that influence our eating behavior.
Definitely. Something else that came to mind when I was reading your book was the whole, you mention it, but the Christian doctrine of original sin. And I was like, they were onto something, because this, we're all born with these seven proclivities towards them. And do you think that's been a net positive or a net negative for society, do you think?
What, that we're all born with these sins?
Yeah, like just that idea of the idea of original sin.
Oh, you mean the theological idea of original sin?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, look, I think that, as I've already said, this is part and parcel of who we are as human beings. But clearly, the fact that we are living in large societies means that those behaviors are not are not conducive to the greater good when we live in broader societies. And so this view that these sins need to be suppressed in some way has obviously had significant beneficial repercussions for humans when they live in broader society. Now, I'm not religious at all. I have to, hold my hands up. But actually, I talked earlier about the brain being responsive to reward and punishment. And there are lots of different ways in which you can generate reward or punishment. So, obviously, in the criminal justice system, if you behave well, you're let free. If you behave badly, you are imprisoned or you're given some other punishment. What the religious framework has done is it's termed that reward and punishment in slightly different terms. So reward is being accepted by society, it's being accepted by the church, it's being accepted into heaven. Punishment is being ostracized by society and being punished in the afterlife. So these are all important cues to try and facilitate pro-social behaviors and to reduce antisocial behaviors. So from a start, I came from this starting point of thinking, oh, this is all rubbish. This is, this concept of the 7 deadly sins is absolute garbage. But actually, by the end of the book, I very much came to the conclusion that this is just another way of inducing behavioral change and inducing changes to the structure and the functions of our brains.
Yeah, it seems to me that when we were roaming as hunter-gatherers, the group functioned so well almost as like one organism, and there were systems built into those kind of groups that would regulate the behavior of the individuals within the group, so that everybody would play ball and the group would function really well, and but then whenever society started getting bigger because of agriculture and all the rest, we needed mechanisms to scale that regulation up, and this is potentially one way of doing that. This idea of
Yeah, precisely that. Yeah.
Have you had? I imagine you have, but I want to ask: have you had any major pushback on the book? Like, have you had any people writing angry emails or anything like that?
Surprisingly not. Surprisingly, relatively few. I mean, I think that there's been some pushback, particularly from the United States, where I think that, some people are religiously and morally more conservative, and I think are slightly more black and white about crime and punishment, and the views around and the views around morality. But what I'm saying is not that controversial. Essentially, what I'm saying is, look, we are a functions of our brains. Our brains are influenced by nature and nurture. It's not that surprising that nature and nurture will influence the output of our brains, which is what we believe, how we move, what we do, how we behave. That I don't think is that controversial. What I'm trying to do is trying to add a little bit of nuance to the thinking surrounding what makes people behave in a particular way. And going back to your point very much at the start of this interview, your example of you being screamed at by your teacher for being cheeky in the context of having some brain dysfunction as a result of your low blood sugar is very representative of what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to illustrate, that, what you take as face value as somebody being a pain in the backside or very unpleasant may not necessarily illustrate the core nature of what that person is. It may illustrate something very different.
Yeah, to be honest, I think your book is, when read properly, it really does allow for a much more compassionate and less black and white worldview, which is what we really need. Are there any aspects that you feel are particularly important, that, like, you're doing a lot of interviews for this now, any that are maybe getting overlooked, or anything you'd like to get asked about more often that you're not?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have been accused of is genetic determinism. and saying, well, we're just a function of our genes. And that's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm saying that genetic factors are clearly important in a range of our behaviors. So we know that's the case, for example, for gluttony, as I've already said. We know it's the case for wrath. So there are individuals, there's a rare syndrome called Brunner syndrome, in whom individuals have a mutation in a particular gene that results in them being unable to break down a whole range of chemical transmitters within the brain. And a lot of these chemical transmitters are involved in emotional regulation. And so individuals with this genetic mutation often exhibit very high rates of aggression and violence. And indeed, more common variants in that gene have also been associated with changes in aggression levels to such an extent that these genetic sequences have sometimes been used as mitigating factors in crimes. And so it's very clear that our genetics has a very major influence on how we behave. But it's important to say that nature and nurture are important, that nurture is as important as nature, and that we're not predestined to be a particular individual just on the basis of our genes alone, that our environment has a massive effect. Just to give you another example, so we talked a little bit about we talked a little bit about the Dutch winter, the Dutch famine. But actually, when it comes to things like our personality traits, and I cover this in regard to pride, there have been some fascinating studies that have looked at parenting style and ultimately whether we grow up with high self-esteem, which of course is, a very useful trait because it allows you to at least, have some respect for yourself, but also to be able to take criticism, to be able to accurately evaluate yourself, compared to narcissism. Narcissism is when you have an overinflated view of yourself and you can't take criticism, which obviously has some very negative consequences. But actually, these studies show that the parenting style has got a fundamental impact on your tendency to be have a high self-esteem or to be narcissistic. So, really demonstrating that this is not all about genes, that it's about environment as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Something else that sprung to mind when preparing for this guy was, if we take the seven deadly sins and we flip them to the opposite, it seems like the opposite of these things are what are often considered virtues in society, things that people
Hmm.
really work on. So
Hmm.
lust, faithfulness, gluttony, temperance, pride, humility, sloth,
Mm-hmm.
agency, industriousness, wrath, kindness, compassion, greed, generosity, and envy. Potentially the flip side of that could be inspiration or encouragement or personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought much about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the subject of another book. Now, whether or not I write that, I don't know. I mean, I think, but actually, it's quite interesting because we talked a little bit about the role that these sins have in our evolutionary biology. But just to take the inverse, if we were completely abstinent, um, then our species would die out. If we didn't eat enough, our species would die out. If we were overly generous to the point where we gave away everything that we had and we had no food or resources, our species would die out. And so it really is a balance between evolutionary pressures, those pressures that come between us and our survival, and the needs, the requirements, the desires of wider society again.
It's that whole idea of like the middle way in Buddhism. You go too far to either extreme, you're in trouble, but find the middle way and you're you're in good territory. So
Precisely.
before we wrap up, Guy, if people leave our conversation with just, like one insight today, like what do you hope that is?
I think it is to reserve judgment. And it's very easy for me to preach. And I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say, occasionally I come across people and I think, God, you're bloody awful. You're a horrible person. And that's intrinsic to us as human beings. But occasionally in moments of clarity, I do think, well, what's going on there? What is it that has resulted in that person behaving the way that they do? What is it that has happened to them in the past, or what is it about their biological makeup that causes them to be the person that they are? And it just makes you reevaluate a little.
For sure. Okay. Well, Guy, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I've really enjoyed this. Where can people get the book? Where can they learn more about your work online? You've got 3 really interesting books. Where would you send people after this conversation?
Obviously, Seven Deadly Sins. If they are interested in the neuroscience of sleep and what that tells us about the workings of the human brain, then The Secret World of Sleep. And if they are interested in how our senses and our brains define our reality, then I would recommend The Man Who Tasted Words.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you, Guy.
Okay, lovely to chat to you, Niall.